Well, romantic intrigue, small-town politics. Our next guest has put together quite an intriguing novel centered around life for those who lived through World War II. His name is Jack London. He is the author of French Letters, Virginia's War. Jack, thank you for coming to Great ASA.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making the trip from Austin.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, listen, before we get into this novel, and my gosh, it's creating such a buzz in the literary world, let's talk a little bit about you and your background.
I grew up in the Panhandle in a small town. I went to undergrad school in the Panhandle, went to law school in Austin.
Yeah.
Got snagged in the Army during the Vietnam War and became a quartermaster officer.
Fantastic. Now, this, I have to mention, this is your first novel.
Yes.
Yes. And I said to you in the break, to do this kind of story and to have, you know, critics jump on it and say this is fantastic reading is pretty good for a first-time effort. Tell us what inspired the whole idea of the book. I know it was a trip you took.
Well, it's not my first piece of writing. I have about 100 pieces of published articles on legal subjects.
Right.
And so learned the writing trade that way.
Right.
But my wife and I were in Belgium. I can't honestly remember if we were on our honeymoon or if we were looking for pieces for our house because we love Belgium.
Right.
And I'm reading the paper one morning and a headline got my attention, farmer sees cow explode. And
you go, what? What's that about?
Yeah, and this farmer's sitting there farming and 50 yards away his cow blows up and cow bits come raining down on him. And it's a pretty intriguing headline, but then the story has some sense to it. This poor cow stepped on a buried landmine that had lain under the soil on his farm for 50 or 75 years.
Right.
It was a hidden after effect of the war.
Right.
And it struck me that that's kind of what we're having happen to us now. A lot of things are happening today that we don't know where they came from, but we can trace them back to the war. To
remnants of the war. So let's talk about this, first of all, the character in this book, Virginia, and kind of set the scene for us with what this novel is about.
The novel is set in a small town in Texas during World War II, particularly in 1944. And in the early days of 1944, before D-Day, things were really kind of uncertain. It wasn't clear how that war was going to go. And in those days, we didn't have emails, we didn't even have telephones that would reach the front. In fact, people sent letters that were called V-mails.
Correct.
And the V-mail was a letter that you would write out, turn it over to the post office, or if you were in the military, you would turn it over to your APO. And they would microfilm it and then throw the paper away, put it on a strip with thousands of other letters.
Right.
And bundle them up, send them off to the other end, and then if you send it from the States to Europe, for example, the post office there would enlarge it and turn it over to you. Every piece of correspondence that was sent was read by the government.
Right. That's just the way it was.
And then there were 3 to 4 weeks between the time someone sent a letter and if everything went fast, the time that the reader received the letter. So you had no idea where your loved ones were. If they were in the war, they had no idea what was going on with you until long after it was over with.
Right, and when you think about the time that we live in now and how quickly technology makes it easy for us to communicate, you think, gosh, how did people do it? It was just a matter of course before we got to this time.
We accepted that.
Yeah. So now, tell me about this story. Set it up for me and how it moves through this fictitious town.
Well, we're in a small town in Texas in 1944, and I think everyone knows what kind of town we have. It's a place where all of the gossips will tell your folks what you did just as soon as you got through doing it.
Right, right.
So if you don't want people to know what you're doing, it's better that you just don't do it at all.
Yes.
And so one day the gossips are sort of startled when they go down to the post office to get their mail, and they look on the bulletin board, and there is tacked on the bulletin board a wedding announcement declaring that Virginia Sullivan, eloped 5 months earlier with her boyfriend who's off in the Army.
Now I want to hold you right there because there's an interesting twist to that, because maybe not even Virginia knows that she's eloped, and that's where we're going to pick up our story when we come back with Jack London in just a minute. everybody. This morning we are joined by author Jack London, who is the author of French Letters, Virginia's War. And what's so interesting is that this book has been so well received at many of the bookstores, on the bestsellers list in Austin and in San Antonio. And it is about a time not long forgotten, but we pick it up with Virginia.
Virginia
Yes.
is the daughter of the local newspaper man who kind of runs the town, kind of does a little business in the black market ration stamps. And so one morning, all of the town gossips are a little startled to go down to the post office and read on the bulletin board a wedding announcement declaring that Virginia had eloped with Will months ago.
Yeah.
And probably the most surprised of all of those was Virginia herself. She had no idea.
Right. And neither did he?
Will, he's in France. He has no idea because he's not getting any mail from Virginia and she's not getting any mail from him. And there's a little bit of a mystery in that.
That ensues into that. Now, one of the things that you talk about are the buried landmines.
Yes.
And explain what that means for the person who hasn't read this book, but it's a very strong note in this novel.
Well, the buried landmine in Belgium, no one buried a landmine so that they could blow that cow up 60 years later. And no one in World War II buried their landmines for us. And by that I mean no one in World War II thought they were fighting that war so that we could have 18.5% credit cards or second mortgages or debit financing.
Yes.
They thought we were fighting that war so that we could go back to the way the world used to be before the war.
Right.
But when you think about it, they really didn't want to go back to that world. No one wanted to go back to the Dust Bowl or the Depression.
Right.
They wanted to go back to a really personal time where people grew up with their cousins and they lived in small towns and took care of each other. And so some of the things that came out of that war that we didn't think about were, on the one hand, electronics. You know, fantastic advances in radar, radio, computers. And one of the negative advances is we created things where Xboxes and PlayStations became objects of desire, and our heroes are kids who do really well playing those games.
Right.
One of the good things is that we got penicillin. You know, life expectancy before the war was on the order of 41, 42 years for most rural people.
Right.
Well, now it's in the 80s, but we also have pancreatic cancer and Alzheimer's, diseases that people didn't get before the war because people didn't live long enough to get those. And so all of the cultural shifting that came out of the war kind of takes me to one real important cultural shift. It's the Poth girls volleyball team. That war changed women's roles forever.
For sure.
Without that war, women would still be dying in childbirth. Women would be living at home. They would not be playing world championship volleyball tournaments.
Absolutely, right. And so we see how the shift of
That's right.
has made everything kind of relevant to how we live today.
That's right.
Yeah. What I love about this piece also is that it is received tremendous honors from the military. And it's not a military piece, but it's a historical piece. The first in of a trilogy. That had to be delightful for you.
One of the things that I really smile about, and I try not to gloat, this is a story about an unmarried pregnant woman, or maybe she's married, you know. Her dad's newspaper says she's married.
Says she is, right.
The Military Writers Society of America made it a finalist for the best historical novel of the year, a book with no battles, no gunshots, an unmarried pregnant woman, and the military writers honored it as the best historical novel. You
know what? I think, this is just my prediction, Mr. London, I think this could be a movie. I think I could play the lead role of Virginia alongside Jake Gyllenhaal. I think so. I
have to tell you, every time I typed another note, I looked at Bridget and said, yes.
She's my girl.
This
is the first of the trilogy that's due out in 2010, correct?
That's correct.
So we look forward to that. Listen, if you'd like to pick up a copy of French Letters, Virginia's War, it's such a good read, you guys. The book signing and reading with author London is happening at Pam's Patio Kitchen. That's at 11826 Wurzbach tonight from 6 to 8 p.m. 512-921-1500. We congratulate you on this.
If I can just sneak in one more comment.
Quickly, go right ahead.
Support your local bookstores.
Did you hear this? Support your local bookstores.
Go down to Twigs. They are great. Everyone in San Antonio knows them.
And a bunch of friendly people.
And a bunch of really kind people.
Thank you so much, author
Thank you.
London.
It's been nice to see you.